right, so our first session will be a presentation by Dr. David Bain about the current state of the southern resident killer whales. Dave, you have the floor.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk about conservation biology of southern resident killer whales, what's new, and I'm realizing what's new kind of goes back 35 years, so it won't be necessarily as new all the way through as it could be. But also want to be thinking about what Orcasound could be doing to help with their recovery. So back in 1990, we saw the first signs of trouble with the population, but it was still growing, so nobody really worried about it. And then the population peaked in 1995 and started a rapid decline. And Ken Balcom and I put together a paper for the Status Review Group, which is a committee within NOAA that kind of checks on marine mammal populations every few years and sees whether they need to be doing anything about it. And we said, you need to do something about southern residents. And the next year, NOAA hosted a killer whale conference. And 2 years later, put together a second conference with Earth Island Institute. And a lot of the initial recovery planning happened at that conference. The next year, NOAA declared southern residents a depleted species under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, but decided not to list them as endangered. So there was a lawsuit that said, hey, southern residents are a species, and once you realize they're a species, their numbers are so small you have to declare them as endangered. And we won that case in 2004, and in 2005 they were listed as an endangered species in the U.S. About the same time, they were also listed as an endangered species in the state of Washington. So that's about 20 years ago now, and things are still worse even after the endangered species listings. They're also protected under the Species at Risk Act in Canada. So the Canadians were well aware that there was a problem. And this I'll go into what's been happening and not been happening, and kind of what the situation is today. So one of the big problems southern residents have run into is whether they're a species or not. And the killer whale experts think that resident killer whales are a species, and southern residents and northern residents would be two subspecies of that species. We also have transients, or Bigg's killer whales, which is a really bad name because Big is famous for discovering resident killer whales. But the transients seem to be the most taxonomically distinct, and people wanted to make sure Mike Big got at least one species named after him. So they figured transients were the best bet to get a species associated with this name. And third species that uses the Pacific Northwest are called offshore killer whales. And thanks to bureaucracy, there's a panel that votes on what the taxonomy should be for legal purposes, and they decided that all the experts who wrote the paper that said residents are their own species would not be allowed to vote on it, and that didn't leave enough people to pass the resolution that says southern residents are a species. So as far as the U.S. government's concerned, all killer whales are still a single species. Even though we had a conference back in 2004 that said we have lots of killer whale species, but the government and taxonomists have not caught up with that. Another problem we've run into is, where do southern residents live? And if you look at the map on the right, you see a little crosshatched area in the Salish Sea, or the southern part of the Salish Sea. It's the critical habitat that the US and Canadian governments recognized. But if you look at the map on the left, the black area is where southern residents actually go. So you see they get all the way up to Southeast Alaska and down to Central California. But the initial efforts to protect them were just focused on the Salish Sea. And still a lot of groups like fishery managers say, oh, they're, Puget Sound killer whales. Why do we care what's happening with salmon in the Columbia? And you kind of look at this other map and you get hints that maybe the Columbia is important. So one of the things that we have made progress with in recent years is critical habitat got expanded to go all the way up and down the West Coast in the US. And the map on the right is a satellite track. And you can see, if you look at the Columbia River, the whales spend a lot of time going back and forth there. And if you look down at the Klamath River, you can see the whales spend some time going back and forth there. And this particular few months, they didn't make it all the way down to Monterey Bay. They turned around a little bit north of San Francisco Bay. But having these satellite tracks and some acoustic data told us, yes, southern residents really do use all this area, which we kind of knew already because we were seeing them in Monterey Bay, and they had to get from Puget Sound to Monterey Bay somehow. And they probably weren't flying or walking or anything like that. So, it was kind of obvious that they had to be swimming through that area. But that is one of the things that we have made progress on in the last few years. We know that salmon is quite important to them, and Chinook is their favorite, and they have to go down deep to get that. And that means they need to be able to detect them at fairly long distances. Because if they go to the trouble to do a long dive, they have to hold their breath for a long time, and they build up a lot of lactic acid. And it's quite a while before they can go back down again. So they really need to have a pretty high batting average if they're going to go down to the bottom and do a serious search for fish. And, one of the things that people have seen with other deep diving species like beaked whales is they have to live in areas with very high prey concentrations so that when they do these long dives, they actually do get something to eat. Because, they don't really have the capacity to get second chances. So realizing how important salmon are, salmon recovery is an important part of the story. And one of the things salmon really care about is water flow. These are 3 pictures of pretty much, the same creek in Bothell. And one on the left shows really high flow. And we call it flashy flow. And that means that when it rains, you get a lot of water going through at once. And flows like this will scour away any eggs salmon have laid and keep them from developing. One in the middle shows what happens when it's too dry and you ask salmon to walk up the creek, and it does not work very well. And then the one on the right is when it's just right. So, we're kind of starting to deal with that, and I think I'll go into that more later. Water chemistry is another thing that we worry about, and just like we can outsource listening to whales, we can also outsource chemistry, and the kids are quite capable of doing it. But anyway, I think we had a big loss recently when the Supreme Court limited the kinds of water bodies that can be protected. So a lot of water bodies that previously were protected no longer have protection since the Supreme Court changed the interpretation of what water bodies are, and that means our salmon are dealing with more toxic chemicals. Temperature is another big issue, and Climate change gets a lot of attention, but you can see if you look at the river on the left, it's kind of grassy on each side, so it gets a lot of sunlight, and that sunlight heats it up. The creek on the right is going through a forest, so it gets lots of shade. And putting in another pitch for the kids, we had third graders do a study on this, and they found that this creek on the right got 4 degrees C cooler from the top of the forest to the bottom. So when we're thinking about climate resilience, reforesting areas is pretty important. And one of the projects I did was raise money to buy the golf course that you can see on the right side. And we're starting to plant trees there and trying to get our shade back. So, it's something where we are making some progress. In-stream survival, when you're trying to get the eggs to grow up and make it out to sea, is a challenge. The picture on the left is kind of a ribbon cutting ceremony for a side channel that was constructed. And the idea was that the water flow in the side channel would be a lot slower. So if you got a flood, instead of having the salmon wash too far downstream, they'd kind of duck into the side channel. And then in calmer days, like when this picture was taken, they can swim around the main channel. Another challenge for in-stream survival is invasive species. So people have introduced a lot of fish into the waterways out here, and some of them are very good at eating baby salmon. So we're trying to eradicate that. And in the budget last biennium, we had some money to do that, but the governor's proposed cutting that out of the budget for this year. I should say our former governor, since we just changed governors a few days ago. Anyway, something that the Orcasound community can do is get in touch with the legislature and say, hey, we need to get rid of these salmon predators so that the whales can eat the salmon instead of these fish that belong in the Midwest. Coastal outflows are another thing. The one on the left shows the new LY estuary. So after the dams came down, a lot of sediment washed out to sea, and you can see that there are a lot of little channels, and you can kind of go out to sea and then go back up the river, and that's kind of perfect for salmon because they have to adapt their physiology to salt water, and it's kind of nice if you can spend some time in the salt and rest in the fresh and go back out to the salt. The other good thing about this is these sandy beaches are perfect spawning habitat for forage fish. And when these juvenile salmon go out to sea, these little baby sand lance and surf smelt, and might get some herring in places like this, or just the right size for salmon going out to sea. So not only do they have this perfect chemical habitat, they also have a new food source that wasn't there when the dams were still in place. On the right is a culvert, and you can see that if you're a salmon, it's going to be pretty hard to do the back and forth in that structure. And it's actually pretty hard for me because the roof of that culvert comes about here. So I've left tissue samples on the, I guess, edge of the culvert there. Fortunately, that culvert has been removed and replaced with a bridge, and we're doing restoration work to create a little pocket estuary there, and that's something where when fish are ready for like a few days at sea between trips into fresh water, they like to duck into creeks like this, and we're going to make that available to them. And the construction work involved in replacing this was heard on Orcasound. So, we got to monitor that, and that meant that, we were in a position to give warnings to the construction crew of, hey, we hear whales. But, unfortunately, they scheduled the work for the summer when whales usually don't use that part of Puget Sound. So anyway, doing these culvert replacements is something that the state has been ordered to do on highways, but this is a railroad culvert, and there are lots of private roads and city roads and county roads that need to be replaced. And Orcasound participants can, ask government to expedite those replacements. Nearshore survival is another thing you worry about. If you're a salmon, the Seattle waterfront is not what you call ideal habitat. Habitat on the right is a little better. And then what they really like is eelgrass and kelp. So the vegetation provides shelter from the bigger predators that go after juvenile salmon, and it's also a place where salmon food can grow. So what we're seeing is kelp beds are getting smaller, and it's not really understood why. There's some thoughts that it's climate change, that the kelp we have here is adapted to cold water the same way the salmon are. It could also be the nutrient base, because we're putting a lot of sewage in the Puget Sound, and the treatment gets rid of things like toilet paper and tampons and things like that, but they don't get rid of the nutrients. So that's something that we've kind of changed the nutrient base, and tends to support things like diatoms rather than kelp and eelgrass. And then another thing that might be a factor are wakes. So, using Orcasound to track kind of how much wake energy ships are putting into the water may help us understand why some of these kelp beds are shrinking. So, if they manage to survive the nearshore phase of their lives, which tends to last a few months, they go out to sea and they have to survive out at sea. And one of the big positive changes we've seen is fish farms have been banned in Washington State. That decision's a little more than a week old now. And a lot of the tribal nations in British Columbia have also banned fish farms. And we know that fish in farms tend to get a lot of sea lice on them. And the sea lice see little juvenile salmon swimming by, and they hop off the farm fish onto the migrating fish, and that leads to a lot of mortality. And with the closure of a lot of these farms, we're starting to see chum salmon survival dramatically increase. So the returns to this area this year are about 10 times larger than they were last year. And one of the consequences of that may be we've had southern residents hanging out eating these chum. Again, Orcasound is a good way to keep track of the whales being around and knowing that they're in this area. Obviously we've got sighting networks that on a day like today work really well, but you get kind of the rainy, foggy days, and whales can go by unseen. So having the acoustic detections for low visibility days and at night tells us more about where the whales are and where we need to be enhancing fish. Okay, for conservation status, there are really two things that we look at to figure out how well we're doing. One is population trends. Is population growing or decreasing? And another thing is how much genetic diversity is left in the population. And, it's kind of threats to the population that regulate that. And then, there's these three laws I mentioned at the start that affect how people are supposed to regulate the threats. So As I mentioned, it's around 1990 that the population growth rate slowed down, and then in 1995 we had a big decline, and that decline is the one that triggered the endangered species listing. And you can see that overall it's continued to decline since then. And I think the slide only goes to about 2020, but the last few years it's kind of bounced around between 70 and 75. And with genetic diversity, I think the Endangered Species Act was written that, you just need to stop populations from going down. But killer whales are capable of doubling their population every generation. And if you do that, they'll maintain 94% of single copy genes. If the population is constant, they only maintain 75%. So, we'd be losing 25% of genetic diversity every generation. And then if the population drops 50% per generation, which is kind of how steep that slope was in the late 90s, only half of single copy genes get passed on to the next generation. And there's a paper that came out recently that said that inbreeding is getting to be a problem for southern residents because the population's been so small for so long. So, it's been under 100 since at least 1960, and it's probably been down in that neighborhood since the early 1900s. So that would be about 4 generations have been in this genetic bottleneck. And their decline probably started in the mid 1800s. So we've had time to lose quite a bit of genetic diversity. So it's not surprising that's become a problem. That's something we'll be keeping an eye on. For threats, prey availability is the main one. Disturbance is kind of been the focus of my career. Persistent organic pollutants are a problem if you don't have enough prey, but it seems like the transient killer whales do okay with high pollutant levels as long as they have plenty to eat, which thanks to the Marine Mammal Protection Act they do. Because, they can only double their population about every 25 years, so they've had a chance to do 2 doublings since the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is a factor of 4 growth in population size. And the pinnipeds that they're eating have had about a 10-fold increase in population. So they've got more food than they know what to do with. They're fat and happy, and even though they're poisoned, they're making it work. Disease is another thing we worry about. Oil spills. We had the Exxon Valdez spill that did nasty stuff up in Prince William Sound. We may have had one spill that affected L-Pod. There was the new Carissa that ran aground and broke up. And, we lost, I think, 4 L-Pod whales that year. And, our tracking data shows that L-Pod tends to swim by where the new Carissa runs aground, time of year that it did run aground. So that may be an oil spill problem here. Incidental takes are not much of a problem in this area, but we did see, I think it was about 9 killer whales trapped in fishing gear in 2023 up in Alaska. So it's something we need to keep an eye on. Invasive species are another concern, if they can restructure the ecosystem and make even less food for the whales. Harmful algal blooms probably have not been a problem here yet, but it has been a problem for marine mammals in other places. I think climate change gets a lot of attention. Ocean acidification is another consequence of high carbon dioxide levels. And or actually the one threat I'm most scared about, because that's going to get worse for the next 50 years, even if we do everything right starting now. And then, of course, all these things can interact with each other. Okay, so for prey availability, knowing where the whales are is important, so we know kind of which fish runs they're likely to be eating. And hydrophones are a great way to keep track of where whales go. The graph in the bottom left shows kind of the total salmon production for the southern resident range. And then these two graphs on the right show returns to the Klamath River. So the one on the top is the fall run, and you can see in some years it's gotten into the low tens of thousands. Historically, that was probably about 1 million fish. And then the bottom one shows the spring run, and you can see that got down into the tens of fish return. And you know, that run also started at about 1 million back when Lewis and Clark were exploring out here. So, you know, if you're expecting to have 1 million fish to choose from to nurse your calf, and you only get, you know, 50, doesn't work very well, and we see very high calf mortality as a result. So I mentioned, you know, the first signs of trouble we saw were in 1990, and that was, you know, the population wasn't producing as many calves as it used to, or many surviving calves. You know, the drone data and hormone data show, you know, southern residents are still really good at getting pregnant. They're just not very good at giving birth to viable calves. And, you know, if you've been following the news, we've had, you know, 3 calves born this fall and winter, and 2 of them are dead already. So that's not a good way to build a population if you can't keep your calves alive. And lack of food is a big factor in that, and using acoustics to track the whales so we know when they're in these areas. So, you know, it's the spring run in the Klamath, it's really bad. And, you know, from our tracking data, we think the spring run is when southern residents, K and L pod, would be feeding on the Klamath if there were enough fish to feed on. You know, the fall run is probably less important to them because they're spending a lot of the fall time up here. So, you know, what's going on down there is less important to them than what's happening in the spring. Disturbance is a big factor. There's been a lot of work done to reduce the impacts of whale watching. We had a new law go into effect here in Washington a couple of weeks ago that requires boats to stay 1,000 yards from whales. And for most boats, that'll make them quiet enough by the time the sound reaches the whale that it's not any louder than the natural ambient. And we're seeing the shipping industry taking some voluntary actions to reduce their noise impact. You know, we still have other sources of noise like fishing vessels and coastal development. Like we've spent, you know, 5 years rebuilding the ferry dock in downtown Seattle, and that's a very noisy process. You know, military activities like military sonar exercises or testing explosives puts a lot of noise into the water that's harmful to the whales if they're close enough. And then there are researchers like me who go around in boats and spend endless hours with the whales. And I finally felt guilty enough about that I do almost all my work from shore these days. So whales don't know I'm around anymore. And what we worry about is it reduces their ability to capture prey, even if it's present. They do avoidance behavior, which requires them to travel farther to get from point A to point B, and it wastes energy. And it also causes stress, which makes them more vulnerable to disease. And, you know, this is something where Orcasound listeners can keep an ear out for boat traffic and, you know, get a sense of, you know, how loud do those boats sound, and How many hours a day are we getting boat noise, and how many hours a day is it quiet? Things like that. And want to mention vessel speed makes a difference. So when boats are going really fast, they make a lot of noise, and the spectrogram on top shows a boat going fast, and you can imagine how hard it might be to find an echo off a salmon if there's that much noise there. And then boats going slow, it's a lot quieter. And we had a law passed in Washington in 2019 that required boats going fast to stay farther away from the whales. But as I mentioned, we got a new law this year that says, stay far away from the whales regardless of how fast you're going. So that really simplified things. The yellow circle is supposed to represent 1,000 yards away, and now everybody just has to stay outside the yellow circle. But before, we had this thing where it's kind of, if you're staying beside the whales, you can get as close as 300 yards. If you're going slow, if you're in front or back, you had to stay 400 yards away. And if you're going fast, it was 1,000. So we'll see if the simplified rule works. And then this graph shows the effect of noise on echolocation detection ability. And the top line is the reduction in range with noise, and the bottom line is the reduction in search area with noise, and the bottom line is the reduction in volume with noise. And the inset is recordings made near whales to get what the received level at the whale would likely be. And natural ambient in this area is about 90 dB. So you can see even on the quietest day, there was like 15 dB of extra noise. And then most days there was about 35 dB or more of extra noise. So if you look at the graph, the volume search, this 15 dB is down by more than 90%. And when you start getting out around 35, the detection range is, down to less than 15% of what it was before. And you see that the chance of a fish being in the area or volume you can still detect, it's really small. And there was a study that came out last year that said, that's right. When vessels are present, foraging efficiency goes way down. And we've done a study, I guess 20 years ago already, that showed that whales don't even try to forage when boats are around. So they kind of know it's hopeless, and they just kind of hang out waiting until they find a quiet spot. And then there are synergistic effects between toxins and prey availability. Some of the key toxins we worry about are PCB and DDT, even though they were banned about 50 years ago. They're still pretty high levels in killer whales. And, we can tell J-Pod from KNL because J-Pod has lots of PCBs, which are industrial chemicals. Industrial area like Seattle has a lot of. And DDT is an agricultural chemical that they use a lot in California, and K's and L's were feeding in California quite a bit, so they have different toxin signatures. PBDEs are flame retardants, and those are still in use, though Washington did ban some of the most dangerous ones, so that's an area where we might have made some progress. It kind of depends on how toxic the replacement chemicals are, because people tend to use them and test their effects later. And then PAHs are combustion products. So that's what comes out of your tailpipe if you don't have an electric car, or comes out of forest fires and fossil fuel powered plants and things like that. And then heavy metals are another toxin that I think whales may be pretty good at detoxifying those compared to what people can do. And this is what stormwater outflow looks like in Seattle. Wanted to mention that car tires are a source of a chemical called 6-PPDQ, which is very toxic to coho salmon and less toxic to other species of salmon, that is a significant cause of freshwater mortality. And with coho, it's really nasty because you get these fish that have survived 4 years and are days or maybe just hours away from spawning, and they get hit by this chemical and die within hours. So they don't get to lay their eggs. And then the juveniles growing up can get hit by this and they die in the stream before they make it out to sea. And it was quite a challenge to track down that this was the chemical that was causing this urban mortality syndrome. But now that we know what it is, we know that there are lots of other related chemicals that come out of tires, including a human carcinogen. That's something the soccer community was trying to say. Our goalies that are crawling around and ground up tires are getting cancer, and now we have the mechanism for that. It's saying that all these things can go together. Disease is something we worry about. We looked at pathogens in whale blows and also antibiotic resistant to them, and we found about a dozen different pathogens that collectively were resistant to about a dozen different antibiotics. And that tells us there's not a real separation between what's happening on land and what's happening out at sea. So the antibiotics that people are taking and pets are taking and farm animals are taking are getting into the marine environment and selecting for antibiotic resistant strains. So if we do decide to try to give medical aid to sick whales, it's going to be more of a challenge because of that. We did give aid to Springer and treated her successfully. She was a northern resident, and we sent her back home, and she grew up and has had a couple calves of her own since then. So that was kind of a success story, but there's not a willingness to intervene effectively with southern residents yet. There has been a willingness to try to administer antibiotics at sea, but the vets were not very good at finding whales when it was time to give them their shots. So that's something the Orcasound may be able to help with, because we can track whales at night and we can leave a message for the vet and say, hey, they're off Nia Bay this morning. Hop in your car, catch a plane and head out there and get in a boat there. And then, maybe the next day say, hey, they're off San Juan Island. This is where you need to go out to give your shots. So, it's kind of a combination of we need a change in the political will that, we are willing to try to take care of sick whales, and then also being able to track their movements more effectively. Oil spills are something we worry about, and something we worry about a lot more now than we did a year ago. Canada opened their Trans Mountain pipeline, and have gone from, I guess, one oil shipment a week to about one a day. So the risk of an oil spill has gone way up. We have been making progress because Washington has been putting together rescue tugs, but we haven't increased the rescue tug capacity to keep it in line with the increased oil spill risk and new places where we have oil spill risks. Already talked about incidental take. This is a European green crab, and it's kind of changing the nearshore environment, which is rearing habitat for salmon. So this is one that we worry about a lot. It's kind of in the northern part of the Salish Sea, but hasn't come to Snohomish County yet, as far as we know. So community volunteers can look for the cast shells of these guys and report them to WDFW, and then there can be capture operations to try to catch and kill them before they spread. And I talked about harmful algal blooms. With pH, there are a lot of mollusks that build shells, and with the pH they're used to, they get thick shells and they grow up and they become good food for other species. But with low pH, the shell dissolves faster than it's built, and they don't survive very long. And the change in the ecosystem structure we expect is we'll go from a fish predominated one to a jellyfish predominated one. And jellyfish don't make good whale food, so that's going to be another factor that makes it harder for the whales. Yeah. We're over time, but I'm close to done.
Yeah, no worries, we'll get it.
Okay. So with climate change, we're expecting changes in ocean circulation. You've heard about the blob, which was this collection of warm water that didn't go south the way it was supposed to, and that killed off a lot of our salmon. We may have an ice-free Arctic, which 130,000 years ago was a good thing, because that let southern residents come into the Pacific Ocean, or the residents that split up to become northern and southern residents. But these days, it means it's an opportunity for invasive species to move through the Arctic, and also diseases to move through the Arctic. So it's something that I'm concerned about. But I guess that depends on whether you're a fan of certain species versus others. Sea level, excuse me. Sea level rise is a concern because we have a lot of construction that goes right down to the water, and if sea level rises, you're going to have barnacles trying to grow on asphalt and paint and things like that instead of the rocks they're adapted to. And that'll be a major restructuring. Floods put salmon in the streets instead of in the streams where they belong. Droughts, I showed the slide earlier about salmon not being able to get up to the spawning grounds because there wasn't enough water. And there may also be some salinity changes, which would pose more of a problem for salmon. So Orcasound listeners can encourage their government to take action to keep climate salmon and whale friendly. And we have been doing some of that here in Washington. Our last coal-fired power plant is supposed to close this year. We're trying to get to carbon neutral electrical generation by 2030, clean electricity by 2045, and we're working on phasing out fossil fuels in transportation, and that includes ferries. And then some of the major decisions that have been made or have not been made that are relevant. There's a pending petition to list the spring chinook and the klamath as an endangered species. That was submitted in 2017, and NIMS was legally responsible for responding to that by 2018, and it's 2025, and they still haven't responded. So that's, kind of government foot dragging is part of the problem. NIMS did make a good decision on critical habitat for southern residents. They did leave out Hood Canal, which was important habitat for southern residents. And we still have some southern residents alive today that spent time in Hood Canal, but NIMS is not protecting that. It's been about 30 years since southern residents used Hood Canal, but Hood Canal has improved a lot in those 30 years. Let's see, so mentioned the culvert decision. The state has till 2030 to comply with it. And they're dragging their feet on that. So it's probably going to be like the education decision where they'll kind of push up to 2030 and say, well, we've still got a few more to do, but we're close, and forgive us. So that's something where, again, our listeners could be telling the state, hey, I know this is a tough budget year, but getting these culverts replaced is something that needs to be a priority. Snake River Dam removal would be a big help to salmon. About 75% of freshwater mortality of Snake River salmon occurs within a mile of a dam. So getting those dams out of the way will very significantly increase the number of salmon that make it out to sea. And the assumption is that the more get out to sea, more will come back when whales can eat them. We had an Orca task force that made a lot of recommendations, and very few of those have been fully implemented. I guess there's slow progress towards implementing them, but expediting that is another thing we could encourage. There's a Canadian Recovery Initiative where, again, they're focusing on whale watching, less so on salmon, and going the wrong direction on oil spills because they're putting a lot more oil into the Save Sea than they used to. Also planning to put a lot more noise into Save Sea because they're expanding the port of Vancouver and also expanding their Point Roberts terminal for ships. So those, one step in the right direction, two steps in the wrong direction, and whales are not doing well as a result of it. And I mentioned the shutting down of fish farms has been a good thing. So, again, I tend to say killer whales are dying the death of 1,000 cuts, and the cure for 1,000 cuts is 1,000 Band-Aids. So, even if you're a little kid, you can be doing things to help out. Like the ones in the bottom left, we're getting rid of invasive species, and top left, they're planting native species to replace them. And, we've got kids doing water chemistry and biomonitoring, or looking at what kinds of invertebrates are living in streams that the salmon could be eating. And they're also a sign of water quality. Some invertebrates need really clean water year-round to survive. Others can live in muck. Won't support anything salmon would like to eat. So, if these kids can do it, then the adults should be able to do something too. So, find your niche and go out and do it. Okay, then kind of one last point on the salmon whale connection is the forest in the background affects water quality in a salmon bearing stream. And we had a community group that was working on protecting the forest, and we said, well, what would happen if we asked whale people to help out? And we brought Mike the inflatable whale to one of our restoration events. And we got a whole bunch of whale groups like Whale Scout and Orca Conservancy and NOAA, and got some water quality groups like Smoking Watershed Council. Wild Orca, I think, was part of this event. We got the Lake Forest Park Stewardship Foundation. Anyway, making it a whale event, we went from about 20 people showing up to about 120 people showing up. So, something that I'd like to see us do with our Orcasound sites, connect people to restoration events like this. And so we want to be able to hear whales on the hydrophone more often. We need more food for the whales. And the way we get more food for the whales is have healthy habitat for the salmon to grow up in. So I'll stop there and leave it to Brendan whether we have time for questions.
Yeah, we can do a few minutes for questions.
On the slide where you're talking about you have a slide where it's a line time series of the population growth,
Mhm.
and it shows it peaking in 1990 and then declining after that.
I peaked in 95, yeah.
95. And it kind of begs, so we're back to where it was like in the 60s or something. But according to that, it looks like something positive happened between the 60s and 95 that made it all grew. And
Yeah, so kind of, okay. Yeah, he was asking for reasons for the population bouncing up and down. And what we had were a lot of captures in the 60s and early 70s. And they probably removed about 75% of the whales that were born in that time frame.
this is for amusement park.
Yeah, so once the captures stopped, there was a lot of food for the remaining population. So the population started growing. And then those whales that were put in amusement parks should have been becoming reproductive adults in the early 80s. And they weren't out there to have calves. So, the older whales that have been around since before the captures were dying and they were not being replaced. And then kind of got the baby boomers starting to have calves. So the ones that were born in the 70s started producing calves, and we got this nice population growth. And, people are thinking, okay, southern residents have been saved because nobody's catching them, and, their population is growing at the rate killer whale populations around the world grow. And then, in 1990, the growth slowed a bit, but it was still growing. So we said, okay. And then all of a sudden we saw this crash. And I think this crash was a combination of fish crashes and also the increase in whale watching. So, less food and more disturbance. And that meant whales were not getting enough to eat. In the early 2000s, we had a fish population boom. So the fish crash ended and the population grew. And we also had the terrorist attack in 2001 that kind of put a lid on tourism. So instead of whale watching growing, it leveled out. So the population started tracking fish. But, after a few years of the fish boom, the fish started having trouble again. So they kind of declined. And then, as we got post 9/11, the economy finally started to recover and tourism picked up. So whale watching picked up. So between increasing whale watching and decreasing fish, we saw a decline again. And we're probably also starting to see inbreeding kick in. And then, the last few years we had COVID, which has probably been good for the fish and bad for tourism. So probably quite a bit less noise around the whales and, more fish. And that's kind of let the population bottom out.
Thanks.
You can hear the difference between a brand new calf and older whales. So if you hear a new calf on the hydrophone, that tells you that, a birth has taken place. For researchers to get out and confirm that, you heard right and figure out, who the mom is and whether it's a boy or a girl, or whether it's healthy or not, and all that stuff.
One more question?
Okay, well, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dave.